Welcome to the Data Democracy, presented by renowned O'Reilly author Ole Olesen-Bagneux, empowered by Xenia. Make your data accessible and discoverable by anyone, anywhere, at any time.
Hi everybody, you're listening to the Data Democracy and I'm your host Ole Olesen-Bagneux, Chief Evangelist in Xenia and the author of the Enterprise Data Catalog published with O'Reilly. In this podcast we explore what an enterprise data democracy is with knowledgeable guests. Today's guest is Matthias Niebuhr. Matthias unfolds something that everyone will be talking about very soon. It's the EU Data Act. No, not the EU AI Act, the EU Data Act that comes into force in the summer of 2025, and it will change industries in a massive way on a global scale, no less. My takeaways from my conversation with Matthias are: first, a data leader takeaway. Prepare for the EU Data Act. Getting a firm overview of your data is becoming an absolute must-have because who that data belongs to is about to change very rapidly. Second, a data democracy takeaway. Be ready for a whole other level of data democracy. A place where tools and technologies you use will have far less ownership of the data you create with them. And third, a personal takeaway. Matthias is a rare lawyer in the sense that gets technology at a very deep level. And it's great to be able to cross professional borders. We should all do that. Okay, enough of me talking. Let's hear what Matthias has to say. Hi, Matthias.
Hi, Ole.
Well, it's wonderful to have you on. This is a special series that we're doing on the EU Data Act. And as my first guest, I thought it was obvious to have you, Matthias, since you are such a reputed specialist in this area. Before we dive into the topic at hand, will you care to share a little bit about your background, where you're based, stuff like that?
Sure. I happen to be a lawyer, and I've been that for way over 20 years. So I'm that old that I actually worked for AOL back in the days. So that's a long time ago. So I've been doing all kinds of IT-related work ever since that, and I've been mostly doing your classic IT law, later data protection. That still is the main focus of the things I do, doing data protection. And I came across the EU Data Act in the course of a project that we had. I'm currently working for a company called BDO Legal. You may know BDO. It's a global group of audit firms, audit tax consultants. But BDO is more than that. BDO also has cybersecurity people, digital people, and also a legal arm in some legislations where that is possible. In Germany, it is possible. I'm based in Berlin, and in the Berlin office, I'm actually the only IT lawyer, but I work a lot with people distributed all over Germany and also within Europe as a legal team. And I came across the EU Data Act with a project that we did. It was a research project of the German Ministry of Transportation. They were looking for a platform, where we were applied to create a platform for data sharing in the context of public transport buses. Because the technology change in public transport is big at the moment. The European Union tries to get carbon neutral by 2030, at least for the public transport companies that want to purchase buses. And this is a huge change for the operations of public transport companies, because in the past, when the driver returned to the base, just fill up the tank, put the key to the board and leave the yard. And currently, the technology change going electric means such a huge change in the operation of those buses. And data, the project realized data is key to really making the change work. And in the context of the project, we learned, okay, data is hard to get from the buses because the manufacturers would only give you a very limited range of data. Standardization is way behind. So the standardization still covers pretty much a diesel world, and manufacturers are reluctant to share more. And in that context, I learned that the Data Act was coming, and the experience also from other projects led to me applying for the expert group that the Commission was seeking to design data B2B data exchange contracts under the new Data Act. So I came across the Data Act, and to me, the Data Act is one big revolution in the sense of providing access to IoT devices of all kinds, including buses. And I think our bus example serves so well as a template for all kinds of other access situations. So this is basically how I ended up in being an expert of the Data Act, which is quite fun.
Yeah, it's very stimulating. I have to say, I was very, very positively affected by our conversation when we had our preparatory call and just got to know each other, Matthias. And I've shared this a bit, but I don't think my listeners know that I taught big data 10 years ago at the University of Copenhagen, and I thought of many of these things, what the EU Data Act is addressing when I taught back then, but there were no, at least to my knowledge, no regulatory considerations about this at a European scale, at least. But we have a lot of time, and I have prepared the listeners that this is a deep dive. We all need to prepare and understand this, so we have a lot of time. And to set the stage, Matthias, can you briefly explain us to the listeners, to me, what is the EU Data Act?
To understand what the Data Act is, you have to first know that there is a digital strategy of the EU, and that comes under cyber strategy and all kinds of digital legislation that is coming, has been coming, and will be coming. And the Data Act is only one piece of legislation in that whole tsunami of digital legal acts. And the most noted is, of course, the AI Act. Everybody's talking about the AI Act. My personal belief, because I'm a Data Act fan, as it's obvious, but my understanding is that the Data Act is actually at least as big as the AI Act. Other pieces of legislation are the Digital Markets Act for basically a kind of antitrust approach to digital markets. Then it's the Digital Services Act, which is a lot of about content regulation, but also some aspects of power. Then you have a whole lot of cyber legislation in the whole field, and the Data Governance Act, which is another piece of legislation that is quite close to the Data Act in the sense of Data Governance Act is about data sharing, the access to data intermediaries. And the Data Act is so interesting because it has first of all, it has many areas. It covers things like access for governments to certain data, IoT data. It covers switching between cloud providers, which is, of course, a very relevant subject, but I personally don't find it too interesting. It is interesting, but yeah, the real issue with the Data Act is access to IoT data for users. That is quite revolutionary. And what the Data Act does is it provides users right to access data that is created while using a product. So it's a user-centric approach to data.
That is such a big deal, and we have a lot of time to talk about it. But if you even, I mean, from a legal perspective, if you are a lawyer, it's a big deal. If you come from a technical IT background or data management background, it's also a big deal. I think a lot of people can sense that this is quite something. And to unfold that, can you perhaps share a bit more about why is the EU Data Act coming into effect? Why are we seeing it coming into effect? What motivates the EU Data Act?
I mean, I'm only guessing, and we talked about this before in our prep meeting, and I'm only guessing, and then maybe if I name companies, then I'm using that as an example, and so maybe it is even made up, but the purpose is to have an example. My example in this field would be John Deere, because John Deere in the past was known that they are pretty much looking up their hardware. So if you bought a tractor from John Deere would consider you apparently legally the owner of that tractor, but they considered the tractor basically some hardware on which software is running. And they claim that copyright protection relates to the software. And they also, under that aspect, as well as contractual law, they perceive the data that is generated in the tractor during the use their property, their intellectual property. There were apparently filings with the U.S. Copyright Office. That was the world as it stood. The consequences were that you could not repair a tractor with free workshops, so they were basically not able to access the hardware, to get the information that you needed to repair. But they also extended that in a way to get really insights into the use of the product, and that's the most powerful thing. They were teaming up already with big players in the agro business, Monsanto, and others to have data exchange with them. And I feel that I totally see the benefits of that, because you want to understand how the machine works, not to overuse chemicals. There's a lot of benefit in them, but also there is a dark side to it. So first thing is that John Deere would control the aftermarket repairs and additional services, but also the data could be valuable. And the value in the data is kind of obvious. My example would be a bean seeding and bean harvesting machine. If you are the manufacturer of a large number of those machines, like John Deere is, and I'm only guessing they may have like a third of the world's machines, then they have the insights on the bean harvest of the world. And that, for financial aspects, like if you were to design financial products, this would be very helpful to have the insight of the real-time bean growth of the world, and then you can have interesting futures in that field. I'm not an expert of that, but it's kind of obvious that the data in that large scale could be super valuable. And I think that is basically the background against which the Commission was designing the Data Act. I think they came more from the right to repair aspect, but at least Parliament, they were considering pretty much also additional aspects, the value of data. And that's how the Data Act came about.
To me, this is just a perfect mirror of very, very precise courses that I gave to the students at the University of Copenhagen 10 years ago, when we discussed, okay, the potential of big data is also a problem in the sense that researchers cannot access the most interesting data because these big tech companies or industrial companies that manage to put software into machines became the owners of this data. So the most interesting research projects back 10 years ago suddenly became defined by big industry and not by open publicly funded research. And that was a big problem, and we discussed this. And so it's a perfect mirror of what you're explaining here, Matthias, that we see these companies that for obvious reasons, even good reasons, work with the data generated by their machines, but they are, of course, locking that into a capsule that makes them the owners of this data. So I can definitely see. So thank you for explaining a little bit about the context of why the EU Data Act is coming into effect. Okay, so moving on, how do you see, Matthias, the way the EU Data Act will change how data is managed within the European Union? As I see it, this is a catalyst of proportions that we cannot really fathom yet. It will change so much. But can you try to unveil and explain for the listeners what is going to happen?
Well, the future is not ours to see. I mean,
No.
first of all, predictions of the future, yet. I mean, it will be very interesting to see how the Data Act will be used. I mean, the first thing, you were mentioning access to data for research purposes. That is not covered under the Data Act. It is the Data Act is user-centered, and it puts users in the driver's seat to decide who receives data. And actually, there's somebody else in the driver's seat, and that's the data holder or even the manufacturer, because it depends on what the manufacturer decides to be open. In the sense of it is a non-discriminatory approach to data access. That means that the user should get at least as much data as is available to potentially available to the manufacturer or to the data holder. If the manufacturer decides not to make data available by giving no means of access, the data is not available. It does not put any additional requirements on manufacturers. If you take our bus example, then the bus has a lot of signals, and you have to find what signals are actually accessible to the data holder, the manufacturer. And some are not, because they're purely internal to a component or within the bus. But everything that leaves the bus, either through an interface or at the bus, could leave the bus there, like a CAN bus access, like in a workshop, or data that is transmitted to the manufacturer. That data is covered, and that's already a lot, because that is, I mean, a manufacturer like Daimler would receive a lot of data already from the buses. So the effect of the Data Act could be that there is less data, because manufacturers say, we don't want to give, I mean, we don't need the data. It's kind of a data minimization aspect. We don't want to give the data. So that would be actually kind of a detrimental effect. Again, the future is not ours to see. It could be a thing. And I mean, talking to manufacturers at the moment, if you look at a company like Daimler, I think they are they've been watching the process of the Data Act all the time. They know what they're facing, and they probably have the infrastructure to provide data, because they already have that. They have cloud services that could actually provide the data, and they probably could. They probably know what the components do. But even they sometimes don't know what data they have or what is accessible. I mean, talking to one manufacturer, they were actually saying, okay, we want to discontinue some services of like legacy products, because we don't have no idea what data we have there, because it's sending, and the people that designed, they left 10 years ago. Yeah. So IoT services that transmit data have been around for quite some time.
Yeah.
So that is one aspect. Maybe one of the effects is that there is less data, which is kind of interesting. Second aspect is the Data Act gives users the right to data. That is the principle, yet it's not unlimited. Access to data can be limited by manufacturers for security reasons and for trade secrets protection. If you look at a product like airplane, a car, there is, of course, a lot of concern that security relevant information is being transmitted out of the car that could be used for interesting attacks on cars and all of that. At least, and the question there is, first of all, is that really true or not? And again, that manufacturers need to find out. And the question is also, what will their approach to the new law be? So will they stonewall everything, claiming it's all super secret and, by the way, dangerous? Or will they have legal fights and regulatory fights? So that's one thing. The principle under the Data Act is that you get access to the data. Even where it's a trade secret, even if it's security related, the rejection is only an exception for rare scenarios. So the principle is, even though it's secret or dangerous, you get the data as a user. Yet you have to comply with this certain conditions, protect the data in a certain way, technical organizational measures that could limit the use of the data. Because you cannot give them away. And in my bus example, so passing the data on to third parties, you need to get agreements with third parties, like the company advising you on the best use of the consultancy, on best use on the of the fleet. The conditions could be so limiting that eventually nobody uses. So that is also one scenario. So that's the not so bright outlook. But on the other hand, if Data Act actually comes, and we've seen that with GDPR. When GDPR came about, okay, we had experiences from directive, but nobody knew how this will work with the new parts of GDPR. And I mean, also, when the Schrems 2 decision was reached in data transfers to the US, so actually nobody knew how a transfer impact assessment would be done. And this same will be for Data Act. So it will take some time until everybody knows what this trade secret protection actually means and how to set up the right process. So that may be a lengthy process, but eventually people may be able to make, and there will be decisions so people know what to do, and then the data will be available. And I mean, it is pretty much dependent, first of all, on how the manufacturers behave, and also on the users, and that depends pretty much on how literate users are. So what?
Oh yeah.
And for the moment, I mean, if you work in data, I mean, you should at least embrace the concept of the Data Act, that there is a lot of data available, and we all should think about the potential uses. And I can tell you from my experience in the last the current year, a lot of users don't even know what can be done with their data. And I was invited to speak at the UITP conference in Barcelona. UITP is the Association of the Public Transport Authorities or providers. And actually, there was not much interest in the data. They have a lot of data issues, but they to them, it's still, we need to sort out data exchange for timetables and everything. But the importance of this use data or the fleet information with every preemptive maintenance, you can see from the data how much brake pad there's left, or how that the way you can charge the bus can be completely different to what the manufacturer says, and still your battery capacity remains. All that, you have to have people that understand the value in the data. So it will be a process for people to learn and challenge a bit the status quo to get there, to understand the value of the data before the data actually becomes as powerful as it can be. Because I think it can be super powerful, but it depends on the users if they actually use the data, want to use.
Of course, that is definitely true. If I try to condense some of it, I don't own a Tesla, but if I did, I would have a picture of my car on my phone. and I would be able to provide to do certain updates of my car via my phone, buy certain features, expand certain things in the ways I would be able to configure my car. And it's a popular saying that modern EVs, they are software that drives people around, right? The same goes for ships, possibly for planes in the near future. Pretty much everything is becoming software, runs on data, that does stuff for us. Goes for fridges, that goes for like IoT devices are all over, and they've been for a while. So I'm thinking about all the providers of software that gives us capabilities. Software vendors that freezes or keeps our food cold, fridges. Software vendors that mowing our lawns with robots. Software vendors that are making sure that we can do economic transactions either via our phone or via plastic cards. All these vendors, what will the future look like for them after the EU Data Act? I mean, and I know this is perhaps an enormous question, but what's your take here? Are the majority of the vendors aware of this, and are they capable of responding to it?
I don't have the market overview to answer that one.
No,
But
it's an enormous question. Apologies.
But no, it's a fair question, and my gut feeling would be no.
Yeah.
I don't think that a lot of I do think that a lot of companies don't know. That's what for the moment, and even again, my bus example that I always use is the companies that provide software for bus operations. They don't necessarily know about the Data Act.
Mm-hmm.
They would be the first ones to offer services. The bus companies themselves don't know the value of the data because, and they so long. I mean, the data there was no use in the data in the past. I mean, they are very slow to realize that there is value in the data. So it will take some time to take up the opportunities of the data. I mean, that is clear. But there will be some companies, there will be good examples, and I'm still thinking of, like, again, also at the moment I'm trying to think of use cases, and use cases now as a lawyer. The use cases may be out of the software world. They may be in completely new and unrelated fields. For example, if you're an investment fund in real estate and you want to buy a 1960s office building, you may now want to get the data out of the heating system to understand how that building works, because of the high prices of energy, the installations or the hardware that is working in the building tells you a lot about the quality of the building. And that is, I mean, something that is decisive for the value of the property.
Mm-hmm.
So, like, thinking of those, it may not. I mean, and maybe I'm wrong. I'm not an expert in investments in office buildings, nor am I an expert in engineering. But my assumption would be, as a engineer assessing the value of a property, I would be interested in that. How the valves in the northeast end of the building, how they work, and what that tells me about the insulation. But without having special cams running, like, this is like a made-up scenario. My other favorite made-up scenario is, of course, ESG report, because everybody is talking about ESG. And if you look at ESG reporting at the moment, companies are the agencies that sell you average consumption of certain vehicles. And that is the basis on which the ESG reporting is done. And that is basically, that's not worth anything, because it doesn't tell you about your fleet if you're a logistics company. The Data Act will provide for new opportunities to get access to make use of the data. So ESG reporting could be pretty precise. So if I have a logistics company like DHL, I could ask Daimler or MAN or whoever for the data, and I can have real-time consumption and real-time carbon emissions that I can use for my reporting. And I can make green claims saying our fleet is 30% below the average of in the industry. So come work with me because I do something for environment. So it's these scenarios that I see, and it may take some time before that comes, but there is value in that. So there's value in the data for at the moment. I think outside the tech industry, people need to understand where the value of data lies.
Mm-hmm. Oh,
so
yes.
That's the big opportunity.
But that is, to me, when you explain this, I think that many listeners would like to know to what extent the consequences of the EU Data Act will manifest itself in some kind of data marketplace, both internally in companies and between companies. And I'm not sure the answer is yes, there will be a data marketplace, or no, there will not be a data marketplace. Because as you describe it, Matthias, it's somewhere in between. I mean, as a sort of a producer of data, I have certain rights that I didn't have before. The tooling that I am using to produce my data with is not the owner of the data itself. The company that produced the tool by which I produce data does not own the data that I produced anymore. So that goes for me as an individual, that goes for me as a legal person, meaning a company, and that opens up a window of opportunity, as I see it, a very fruitful window of opportunity where more companies can compete more fairly on the basis of data. And I would call that a data marketplace to some extent. But I don't know if you agree in this. What are your thoughts here?
Yeah, I mean, well, terminology, and I don't know. Don't get me started here, but it's of course I totally hear you. I mean, the first benefit is that for the user. Okay, I understand my machine better than before. Somebody can help me with that. So consultancies are out there, and they will be competing as to how to understand the data better and provide a better service to the users. So basically, the companies that run machines. That is obvious. That when we're talking about a marketplace, I can tell you also from the experience of a bus project. There will be a big problem not getting access to the data, because that is hopefully solved. In the long run, you will get the information from the manufacturers. You will be able to understand the data better than you used to, and so you understand your product better. But one benefit would be if you could compare your data with the data of others. So basically, how is my fleet doing in comparison to another? Or for an investment decision, okay, I'm living in India or Copenhagen or wherever, and I want to buy a car. So if everybody were to share the data, you would say, okay, what's the weather like in that region? Is it comparable to my weather in another region, in maybe Ireland, or don't know? Or so what does that tell me about using a certain type of electric vehicle? So how's the performance? Is it hilly? Is it flat? Is it all that data, if shared, could give you a better overview on how to use your product, or first of all, choose your product, use your product. So that would be interesting, and that would be true value. Yet in our bus project, I mean, the concerns that our bus companies that are part of the project raised rightly is, well, we are competing against each other. And yeah, well, in our project, we even we cooperate, but still we are competitors in a network. When it's put on tender, we may be competing.
Mm-hmm.
So there's, of course, competition law issues, and so forget the lawyer stuff. But it's in the first place, it's also I don't trust the others so much that I do want to give all my fleet data away, because that tells anyone how I operate my fleet.
Exactly. Yeah. That's the
What is
dilemma, right?
interesting is that's what they have been doing, or and a lot of industries have been doing in the past, because all the data would be sent to the manufacturers. They were in the position to know, pretty much understand how fleets operated or how workshop was operating. But in the future, the question of trust will be super important. So if you are, and that's basically aside from access to data, and that's the Data Act is all about freeing the data, getting them out of the device, in as much as is permitted by law, which is yeah, to the extent the manufacturer would get the data. But the next level will be data exchanging data. So if you have a data market, that would require that people are willing, are trusting each other to give away data, and that to overcome that reluctance, that will be quite a challenge. So companies that are setting up data or are interested in data sharing, they will need to tackle that problem. How to trust the others and the use of the data. So basically, that's one of the aspects. I mean, the Commission is already, I mean, they understand that there is an issue with that. And that's why we're sitting in this European Commission's expert group to set up data exchange contracts between the parties, because yes, that's the issues. I mean, already if it starts with data holder, i.e., for example, manufacturer, and the user, trade secret protection, and that is, but you have that in even more relationships out there. Once the data is out of the device, people need to define the regime, the legal regime, how to exchange data, and that needs to be supported by, of course, technology.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Because yeah, well, I mean, as a lawyer, I can tell you, writing NDAs is one thing, living NDAs is another. And
Yeah. I rarely deal with lawyers. It's not that I don't like lawyers, but it's just a very, very different way of discussing technology. And sometimes, to be honest, it's frustrating. But definitely not with you, Matthias. It's, many of the things that you mention are things that is being discussed. I'm sure you know this in tech environments and in the tech community. Data contracts is something that in the last couple of years got a lot of hype, and perhaps also a bit too much, basically as a way of automating and formalizing how data is being exchanged, but not in the proportion. There's an excellent book, by the way, by Andrew Jones on data contracting, published at Pact, the publishing house Pact. But you mean not at all in the proportions that you are describing here. This is like thinking about how to integrate and exchange data between applications in an enterprise setting. So it's much more encapsulated, much more down to earth, everyday IT operations talk. But what you're discussing here is a way bigger structure that plays a role at a societal level, and that is why it's both very intriguing but also a little difficult to understand. What on earth will this EU Data Act do? I still have a couple of questions left, but just to wrap up some of the takeaways is, so you're definitely describing what could be a potential wave of decommissioning legacy IT, legacy IoT already, because people have simple too little knowledge of what these technologies do, what data they contain. And so in order to comply with regulation, more IT is being phased out or decommissioned completely due to the fact of the EU Data Act coming into effect. And that, from a technical perspective, would be quite wonderful, but also very dangerous, because that is also always the danger in a company to decommission IT, that you don't know what it's doing. I've been doing that in my career quite a lot, and that is it's a data horror nightmare. So, but I can definitely see a wave like that, and then there are more uncertain things that taps more into the understanding of, okay, what does this particular user, either a citizen or a company, how data literate are they? To what extent they understand the data potential, and how can they make use of that potential? And that is a more open question. But I see companies that do not prepare, and this is perhaps a yes or no question. I like to ask open questions, but just for me, on my understanding, and for the listeners, I see any company that is not preparing for the EU Data Act as a company that has a big problem when it comes into effect. I mean, if John Deere does not, we mentioned John Deere directly earlier, if John Deere does not change the way they operate, maybe they already have, I don't know.
They have, yes.
They have, okay, so they will be pleased by, they will be pleased by being mentioned here.
They have reacted, yes. Apparently, I'm not an expert of US law, but apparently they even adapted their, they have an agreement with kind of it's not a union, but an association of American farmers, and there was even an executive order apparently by President Biden to address the issue of right to repair. So right to repair apparently is a big discussion in the US ongoing. So there will be, I mean, that will also be an interesting aspect, as the EU Data Act not only applies to European companies, but also to any company that exports to Europe. It will be, again, and then, I mean, everybody's talking about the Brussels effect. It will have effects on non-EU companies. They will need to adapt and also maybe influence legislation. And I think that is something the EU is also taking into consideration, being the thought leader in data access of that kind.
Yes. That leads me to the next question. This is the Data Democracy Podcast, and it rings a different bell in the US, the name of this podcast, or in certain parts of the US tech community, than it does in Europe, because I think Europeans, although we are always saying we are divided and that nothing unites us really, I think one thing that really unites Europeans is data. We have this conception, this understanding of data as something that should be treated correctly, that should be shared under certain rules and regulations. That is very natural for Europeans to consider, and I think less natural for Americans. So data democracy is something very dear to my heart. And to what extent, I mean, what are the perspectives of data becoming democratized with the EU Data Act? Can you give some kind of big perspective on that, or is the question too big or a little off?
We need to talk terminology here. What do you mean by that, and everything? So, democratize in the sense of, first of all, the first step is empowering people, and empowering users, and that step is done by the Data Act, because you are, as a citizen or a company, you are empowered to make use of the data that there is. And the details will be bumpy. I mean, so what does that actually mean? Where the limitations? There will be a lot of questions, but in principle, that is something that that is very powerful, and really puts users' interests and frees the data. It makes data available, and that is a very democratic aspect, I would say. So that's the beauty of the Data Act.
Yes, definitely. And And of course, being a lawyer, you will, of course, answer that we need to discuss terminology deeply. So I guess that's only fair. That's only fair, Matthias. But it's definitely it's definitely something. I mean, as I see it, and read the press releases and the introduction material on the European. On the various EU sites describing it. I definitely see the EU Data Act as something that democratizes data. But of course, once you get into both technically the bits and bolts and then legally the paragraphs or the texts, of course, it's way more subtle to discuss, okay, what is actually then democratized data. You could write an entire book about that, I guess.
Absolutely. And I'm also very curious. I mean, you asked me about what will the Data Act do, and the question is, who will be the first ones to adapt it practically? Who will be the users that actually go after the data? And I mean, I have a rough idea who that could be, and it's not you and I as citizens, but it's big players. And one of the big players, I mean, the big lobby fight in Brussels was ongoing between companies like Lufthansa and Airbus. I mean, they were the ones that. So again, a kind of John Deere scenario, but with planes and a lot of bigger investments involved. So there will be big players that know the value of data, and they will probably be the ones that make way for then using data by us citizens. For users like how's my fridge doing? The question is that there you would need to have basically entrepreneurs that give you an incentive to use the data, because except for a few nerds, and I can imagine people that like to hack their fridge, probably to play Doom on it.
Exactly.
But except a few nerds, nobody is interested in the data, except you have a good reason to have the data. So it would be a meta control system for your fridge or your heating system. So in the consumer field, I don't know what models will there be. You spoke about Tesla. Of course, like Tesla is offering usage-based insurance policies, and the insurance industry is, of course, very much interested in that. So that would be a field of is it democratizing? I mean, ask data protection folks. I'm not very happy about this, but it is. So the question is, where will it be happening? And it's really hard to tell where things will be happening.
I think the perspective you provided here is that prior to our conversation, I was imagining that the EU Data Act would be kind of a can opener of innovation in Europe in particular, because Europeans have been kind of just giving all their data to big tech in the US, and that could change with the EU Data Act. But you're pointing at, and that may happen. But also what you're pointing at here is also that there's simply a power play that will unfold between the established players, being the providers of the manufacturers of machines with embedded IT, such as Airbus, and the users of those machines, such as Lufthansa. And that power play will happen in every single vertical that we can imagine. It will happen in pharma, it will happen in transportation, it will happen in electronics, I mean, all over. And that power play is not necessarily something democratic, and it's not necessarily something beautiful, but it will also the market for certain.
Yeah, but it's to contradict you a little bit. I would say you need the big players to open up the can, because I mean, if I were to go after, I don't even have a networked fridge, but to go after the fridge selling company or the fridge maker, first of all, I have no interest in the data.
No,
except
no,
to
no.
play Doom on my
It's boring
fridge.
data. Yeah. It's boring. It's just.
But other than that, and it's way too cumbersome. I mean, why would I sue, let's say, Bosch to get access to the data, and they would claim, well, it's a trade secret. Why would I do that? Because it is just painful. And I mean, also, what is puzzling about the Data Act is the implementation will be quite a challenge. The Data Act comes not necessarily with data protection related areas. It comes with penalties like GDPR, but it will be the member states that will have to sort out penalties for non-providing data. And so we don't know what the penalties will be and how efficient the actual enforcement. So what will will the data protection authority be the supervisory authority? Will it be the competition authorities? Will it be the telecoms networks authorities? Will it be a new body? How long will the procedure be? And that's something you don't want to. I mean, that's for a user with your fridge. That's nothing you want to start. Unless you have like a Schrems-like approach, you're an activist. Then maybe they will be also powerful, maybe, but it will be the big players that will set precedent, of course.
Yeah.
The question is, will we know that they set precedent because they probably keep quiet about it?
Yes. I know a little bit about the setup in Airbus and various other industries, and basically I've been in this field all my life where you're searching for data inside companies, so enterprise data, and that's not an easy job. And I dare say that you will not find any mid-sized to large industrial company that is good at searching for the data across the data estate. And that is why I can see the EU Data Act as being a huge game changer for the disciplines and technologies that I have worked with all my life. Okay, so Matthias, just to wrap up the conversation, when will the EU Data Act come into effect?
We're in the final phase of lawmaking, and the European Parliament has already approved the Data Act. And if the Council now approves, then the Data Act will become law. Will become into effect, I think, 20 days after the decision by the lawmakers, and then it will have a period of 20 months to be applicable to companies regarding this concept of data access at the data holder, meaning if the product doesn't have an interface, that way you can get access to the data already, and the data is stored with the manufacturer, you have a right to receive the data from the manufacturer in 20 months' time. And so given the extra couple of weeks that we need, so it will be end of 2025. And for all new products that will need to be produced, that will be another year. So data access by design defaults, that will be implemented within another year. So we're talking end of 2026. So by then, there should be equal access to data from devices like a manufacturer.
There are many things going on in my head right now, Matthias, because I'm trying to think about how to actually build that, and it's data access by design is a term that I will not forget. This is extremely complex to actually make happen once it unfolds. I am a big fan, I will admit that, of the EU Data Act. I think it will mean a lot of things in terms of private persons getting access to more data. I hope it will bring about a wave of innovation in Europe. I would also love to see a lot of legacy IT being finally phased out and decommissioned. I dare even say flushed out the toilet because it's just so difficult for companies to deal with all this legacy IT. So taking a step back here, Matthias, thank you so much for providing deep expert insights in the EU Data Act. It was a pleasure to have you on. And I hope that all the listeners got a lot out of this conversation. I'm very sure they did. And if they want to reach out to you, Matthias, where can they find you?
Well, you can find me with BDO Legal in Berlin. So happy to talk about this topic and get deeper into it. I mean, I really I'm very much into discussing the Data Act, and I'm a learner in that field. I'm trying to understand what the Data Act will be and what the business opportunities might be, and to provide the legal framework around it. So I'm very curious.
Thank you, Matthias, for being on.